I remember the exact moment everything in my world shifted. It was a Tuesday, early September, still warm enough that you could leave the windows open and let the air float in like a lazy thought. Daniel and I had just sat down for dinner, grilled chicken, roasted potatoes, and a side of the green beans I'd picked from the backyard garden that morning. I didn't know that meal would be the last we'd ever have as husband and wife, not really. We'd been married 25 years. A whole silver anniversary. We had plans to Italy in the spring, a little house up north when he retired, maybe grandkids someday. We'd spent so many years becoming the kind of couple people looked at and said, "That's what I want one day." We had the kind of love that looked good in pictures. But that night, Daniel looked at me like a stranger trying to remember why he came to the room. He cut into his chicken, took a sip of his wine, and without even putting his fork down, he said, "I don't love you anymore, Rachel." First, I didn't think I heard him right. I blinked, tilted my head like our dog Bella does when you ask her a silly question. I stared at him, waiting for him to laugh, or say something about how long a day it had been. But he didn't. He just looked at me, eyes steady. Then he said, "I've met someone else. I want a divorce." And just like that, 25 years dissolved into steam above mashed potatoes. The next few days were a blur. You know that feeling when you stand up too fast and the room spins? That was my mind for about a week. I walked around the house like I was still dreaming, folded his socks, packed his lunch the next morning out of muscle memory, even laid his reading glasses on his nightstand. I was stuck between fury and disbelief, but mostly, I was just numb. The kids took it hard. Emily was away at college and she came home the next weekend just to sit on my bed and cry with me. Jacob, our middle child, called me from Colorado, voice shaking. "Tell me you're joking," he kept saying. And Lily, our youngest, still living with us, stopped speaking to her dad entirely. The silence between them could have broken glass. Daniel didn't fight. He packed up half his closet and his laptop, and left with an overnight bag. He didn't even take his golf clubs. 3 days later I found out who she was. Her name was Celeste. 42. A marketing executive at his firm. The kind of woman who wore tailored blazers and red lipstick like it was armor. I knew of her vaguely. Daniel had mentioned her once or twice. "She's sharp," he'd said. "Great ideas." Now I wondered how many of those great ideas had been whispered between meetings or over cocktails when I was home reheating lasagna. The divorce moved fast. Daniel was eager, too eager. That was the first red flag. But I wasn't stupid. I'd helped build our business from the ground up. I'd spent years balancing the books, working nights while the kids were asleep, attending fundraisers and smoothing over deals when Daniel was too blunt with clients. Half of that business had my fingerprints all over it. So I got a lawyer. A good one. Her name was Beverly, and she didn't blink once when I told her what Daniel had said. She'd seen it all before. Men in their 50s chasing their second youth like it was a reward for loyalty. In 6 months, the gavel hit the wood and I walked away with my half. No more, no less. Half the business, half the assets. The house went to me. He kept the beach condo, which was fitting. He'd always loved the sea, even though I hated sand in my shoes. I cried in the parking lot of the courthouse. Not because I regretted the outcome, but because it was really over. And even if I hadn't realized it until then, a part of me had been waiting for him to change his mind, to say it was all some terrible midlife breakdown. But he didn't. The months that followed were quieter than I expected. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't anyone's wife. That was a strange sentence to say out loud. I said it once to my reflection in the bathroom mirror and burst into tears. Not because I missed him, but because I didn't know who I was without the we. I got a haircut, dyed my hair auburn just to see what it'd feel like. I started painting again, something I hadn't done since college. I even went to a pottery class where I met a woman named Martha who invited me to a book club that turned out to be more wine than books, and God bless it, I needed that. The kids visited more. Emily brought a new boyfriend who actually helped me fix the fence. Lily finally started smiling again. Life was beginning to unfold in a new shape, one that didn't include Daniel's shoes by the door or his coffee mug in the sink. And then 6 months later he came back. I was in the backyard trimming the roses when I heard the gate open. I turned, shears in hand, and there he was. Daniel. In a blue sweater I didn't recognize and a face I barely did. He looked thinner, paler, like a man who'd slept on too many couches and hadn't tasted real peace in weeks. "Ratch," he said, like we were picking up a conversation from the day before. "Can we talk?" I didn't say anything, just stared at him over the hedge of rose bushes. A thorn pricked my glove and I barely felt it. "I made a mistake," he said. "Celeste, it didn't work out. I've been thinking a lot. About us. About what I threw away." His voice cracked. "I want to come home." And here's the cruel, confusing truth. My heart fluttered. For a fraction of a second I wanted to run into his arms, bury my face in his chest, and pretend like none of it had happened. Because I still loved him. That love hadn't evaporated. It had only been bruised, beaten, boxed away. But I also remembered the salt I passed him that night. The way he said it so plainly. The way he never looked back. So I swallowed the flutter and said, "I'm sorry, Daniel, but this isn't your home anymore." His eyes filled with tears and maybe mine did too. But I didn't let them fall. Not yet. It's strange how quickly the silence returns after someone tells you they still love you, but can't take you back. Daniel stood in the backyard for a while after I said no. Neither of us moved. The air between us was thick with things unsaid. The roses rustled, the wind picked up a little, and somewhere down the block a dog barked. But here in my little square of the world, time stopped. He finally turned and left without a word. Just like he had the first time. Only now, I didn't watch him go with my heart split in half. I watched with a dull ache, like touching a bruise you already know hurts. And then, just like that, he was gone again. That night I didn't sleep much. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling fan spinning slow above me, making that soft rhythmic creak I'd always meant to fix. The house was quiet, except for Bella shifting in her sleep and the occasional creak of the old pipes. It was the kind of quiet that used to make me feel lonely, but now it just felt mine. Still, I couldn't stop thinking about what he'd said. "I want to come home." Home. Funny word, isn't it? For years it meant wherever Daniel was. Then it became wherever he wasn't. And now suddenly he wanted back in like nothing had happened. Like the wound hadn't gone deep. Like he hadn't left a version of me sitting on the kitchen floor, clutching a coffee mug and sobbing while the lasagna turned cold. And yet, a part of me still wanted to believe him. That part whispered, maybe he means it. Maybe people change. Maybe love comes back if you leave the porch light on. But the other part, the stronger one now, said, "Rachel, don't you dare forget how much it cost you to crawl out of that darkness." A few days later, I was at the farmer's market, picking out tomatoes and pretending to be fascinated by handmade candles when I saw him again. He wasn't following me. At least, I don't think so. But there he was, 3 stalls down, holding a jar of fig jam and talking to Mrs. Whitaker, who still ran the preserves booth every Saturday like it was her holy mission. I ducked behind a stand of sunflowers and cursed under my breath. "Mom," Lily said, appearing next to me with the basket full of peaches. "Are you hiding from jam?" I sighed and peeked over the petals. He was laughing. Not with the ease he used to, but with that same crooked smile he'd had since college. "I'm hiding from a memory," I muttered. Lily followed my gaze. "Oh," she said. Her tone shifted, subtle but sharp. "You want me to go spill something on him?" I almost laughed. That girl had her mama's fire. "No, baby. Let's just go." We slipped away without him seeing us, and I felt oddly victorious. Not because I ran, but because I didn't run to him. Progress. That night I called Beverly, my lawyer-turned-friend. She picked up on the second ring. "Let me guess," she said. "He's trying to buy back the cow now that the milk is gone?" "Something like that," I said, curling up on the couch with a blanket and a glass of wine. "He showed up, told me it was a mistake, that he wants to come home." "Classic. You say no." "Yes." She exhaled a soft sound of approval. "Good. How do you feel?" "Confused," I admitted. "Angry. Relieved. And then guilty for feeling relieved." "That's grief, hon. She's a shapeshifter. One minute she's sobbing in the shower, the next she's making lasagna like nothing happened. You're doing fine." We talked for an hour about everything and nothing. When we hung up, I stared at my phone for a while, thought about calling Daniel, just to ask why now, what changed. But I didn't, because I already knew the answer. Celeste had changed. Or more likely, she'd never been what he thought she was. Maybe the thrill wore off. Maybe she wasn't ready to play house with a man who left his wife of 25 years like he was trading in a car. Maybe he thought I'd just be here waiting. 2 weeks passed. Then 3. He sent a few texts. Short ones. "Hope you're okay. Thinking of you. Can we talk?" I didn't reply. He sent flowers. White lilies, my favorite. No note. They sat on my porch for a day and wilted. I didn't bring them in. I was rebuilding. Quietly. Slowly. In the rhythm of my mornings, in the hum of the laundry machine, in the way Bella curled up at my feet while I painted. And yet, every night, I lay in bed and asked myself the same question. Do I still love him? The answer was always yes. And that's what made it so hard. Because love isn't always enough. Sometimes it's the very thing that keeps you shackled to a past that no longer fits. The 4th week after his reappearance, Emily came over for dinner. She brought a pie and her new boyfriend Nate, who was charming and nervous and overused the word absolutely. After dinner, she helped me do the dishes. Just the two of us in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, soap suds flying. "So," she said, not looking at me, "Dad told me he came by." I nodded, scrubbing a plate a little too hard. "He said he wants to come back. He said he made a mistake." "He did," I said. "Both things." She paused, wiped her hands and turned to me. "Do you want him to?" That was the question, wasn't it? "I don't know," I whispered. "Part of me does, but not the part that trusts him." She nodded slowly. "I love Dad, but I don't think he deserves you." That undid me. I reached out and pulled her into a hug, soap and all, and cried into her hair. Because my daughter, the little girl who used to leave sticky notes in my lunchbox that said "You're the best, Mommy," was now old enough to see me clearly, to protect me, and that, more than anything Daniel had ever done or said, told me I was going to be okay. The next day, I wrote Daniel a letter. Not an invitation, not a door cracked open, just words I needed to say. For me, Daniel, I'm not angry anymore. At least, not in the way I was. I think there's always going to be a part of me that wonders how we got here. How something so strong could fall apart so fast. But mostly, I think I'm grieving the version of us that believed we were unbreakable. You hurt me. You left. And in doing so, you taught me what it means to survive. I still love you. That's the part that will always be hardest to carry. But I don't trust you. And I can't forget how small I became trying to be enough for someone who had already chosen someone else. I'm building something new now. It's quiet. It's gentle. And it doesn't include you. Take care of yourself. I mean that. Rachel. I didn't send it. Not because I changed my mind, but because I didn't need him to read it. I needed me to say it. And that was enough. There's a particular silence that comes after the storm. Not the eerie kind you get before thunder, but a heavier one. The kind that settles on your chest like a blanket you can't quite shake off. That's where I lived for a while. In the silence. After Daniel tried to come back, and I said no, life didn't explode. It didn't erupt into chaos or collapse beneath me. It just kept going, which is sometimes even more disorienting. Because what do you do when the most dramatic chapter of your life closes? And you're still standing in the same kitchen with the same dishes, and the garbage still needs to be taken out. You relearn how to live. And sometimes you do it badly. The first month after the return, that's what I called it in my journal, I kept thinking I'd feel proud, strong, unshakable. But instead I felt hollow. Not all the time. There were good days. I'd go to yoga in the park, or make myself something decadent just because no one was watching. Fettuccine with too much cream, wine at 2 p.m., the whole bottle if I wanted. I could lie in the bathtub until my fingers pruned, and the cat cried outside the door. But there were bad days too. Like the Tuesday I found an old voicemail from Daniel. It was from 3 years before. He'd called to say he'd be late, because he was stuck in traffic. Said he missed me. Told me to save him some meatloaf. Then added, "Love you, Ratch." I listened to it 3 times. Then I deleted it. But not before I cried into a hand towel on the kitchen floor. I started seeing a therapist. Her name was Connie. She wore oversized glasses and cardigans with patterns that didn't match. And she had this soft way of listening that made you forget you were paying for it. In our second session, she asked, "Do you think your love for Daniel was more about comfort or connection?" I stared at the ceiling for a long time before answering. "Both," I said finally. He was my person, and also my anchor. But somewhere along the way, I think I became his furniture. Furniture. You know, something dependable, familiar, easy to take for granted. Connie nodded slowly. What happens when furniture decides it doesn't want to be sat on anymore? I smiled despite myself. I guess it redecorates. One night, I got a message from Celeste. I was shocked to see her name on my phone screen. I thought about not opening it. I really did. But curiosity has teeth. It was short. "Rachel, I know it's not my place, but I wanted to say that I'm sorry. For all of it. You didn't deserve what happened. And for what it's worth, he talked about you all the time. Like he'd lost something precious, and didn't realize it until it was gone." I stared at the message for a long while. Then I put my phone down and walked into the kitchen, pulled out the bottle of red I'd been saving, and poured myself a glass. I didn't reply, not because I was angry, but because some closure doesn't come from conversations. Sometimes it comes from silence. Spring rolled in slowly, like it was afraid to commit. One day it was 75 and sunny. The next we were back in flannel and fuzzy socks. The dogwood in my yard bloomed late, and I took that as a sign. I wasn't sure of what. Just something. I threw myself into the business. The half that I now fully ran. Funny. For years I'd played support, logistics, accounting, client relations, but Daniel had always been the face. Now it was mine. And I didn't hate it. Actually, I thrived. People started noticing. Beverly said it first. "You've got this glow now. Like a woman who finally remembered she's the sun." Even our clients, ones who used to speak only to Daniel, started calling me directly. I'd always had a voice. I'd just forgotten how to use it. It felt good to be seen. Around that time, someone new entered my orbit. His name was Thomas. He ran a landscaping business, had a laugh that sounded like gravel in a jar, and wore button-downs with the sleeves always rolled up. The first time we met, I was yelling at the irrigation system in my backyard, barefoot and muddy, and he leaned over the fence and said, "Looks like you're losing that argument." I rolled my eyes. "Do I look like I need help?" "Nope," he grinned. "But I'm offering it anyway." He fixed the damn sprinkler in 10 minutes flat, and made me laugh twice in the process. It wasn't love. It wasn't even flirting, really. But it was warm. And I hadn't felt warm in a long time. We started talking more. He brought over extra mulch one weekend. I baked him banana bread. We swapped books. Turns out we both like true crime podcasts and old spy thrillers. It wasn't a spark. It was a slow burn. A steady flame in a world that had once scorched me. I didn't tell the kids right away. I wasn't ready. But I did tell Connie. Do I have to feel guilty for this? I asked one day. For what? For smiling when he texts. For thinking about someone else. For being happy. She tilted her head. That wise bird expression. Rachel, you survived a heartbreak most women would have drowned in. You're allowed joy. You're allowed everything. So I kept smiling. Daniel called again in May. 6 months since he tried to come back. I answered. Not because I wanted to, but because I wasn't afraid of his voice anymore. Hey, he said quiet. I don't even know why I'm calling. It's okay, I said. Neither do I. There was a long pause. Then he said, I saw Lily the other day. She didn't speak to me. I know, I replied. She hates me. She's hurt. It'll take time. I don't blame her, he said. I blame me. Every day. It hit me then, how small his voice had become. How different. Like the man I'd loved had melted down into someone fragile. I hope you're taking care of yourself, I said softly. I'm trying. Good. We didn't say goodbye. We just hung up. And that was the last time we spoke. One evening, I sat on the porch watching the sun melt into the trees. The sky was streaked in that sherbet pink and orange that always reminds me of family vacations. Bella curled up at my feet, snoring gently. Thomas texted, There's a food truck fair by the lake. You hungry? I smiled. Typed back. Starving. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't hesitate. I just went. Not as a wife. Not as someone healing. But as me. Just me. And somehow, that felt like a miracle. I've always believed that the things we hold on to the longest aren't just the ones we love, but the ones that remind us who we used to be. Old letters, birthday cards, recipes in fading ink, sweaters that don't fit anymore. They're not things. They're memory anchors. After Daniel left, and then tried to come back, I found myself clinging to some odd little pieces of the past. A mug he gave me on our 10th anniversary. A playlist we made one winter on a snowy day. A photo of us on the pier in Maine where he looked like he could fly just from joy. I told myself I kept them for the kids. For the memories. But the truth was, I hadn't decided if I wanted to keep that version of myself. The woman who believed love meant staying, even when it started hurting. That changed one rainy Sunday afternoon. I was cleaning out the attic. Spring cleaning that bled into summer, because, well, emotions aren't exactly efficient. There were boxes up there I hadn't touched since the kids were in high school. And one of them, one I didn't even label, was packed to the brim with Daniel and Rachel. Our wedding invitations. The cork from the champagne bottle we popped when the business turned its first real profit. His old college hoodie I used to steal. Notes he'd written me. Some sweet, some funny, one scrawled on a Chinese takeout receipt that just said, Ratch, you're everything. I mean that. I sat there on the attic floor, dust in my hair, clutching that damn receipt like it could whisper back time. I didn't cry. Not this time. Instead, I did something that surprised even me. I made 2 piles. One for the memories I wanted to keep, and one for the ones I didn't. The receipt went into the let it go pile. Not because I stopped loving that version of him, but because I finally stopped needing her. The woman who held her breath every time he pulled away, who blamed herself when the warmth left his eyes. That afternoon I felt like I'd done something sacred. Like I'd buried a ghost. I told Lily about Thomas a week later. We were sitting in the kitchen eating strawberry shortcake straight from the bowl, which is how most of our best talks happen. She looked up from her spoon, narrowed her eyes playfully and said, So are you in love or just well-fed and flirty? I laughed. God, I don't even know. It's different. He's kind. And calm. He listens. Like really listens. She nodded slowly, taking another bite. You're lighter now. You laugh more. And you stop talking to the cat like she's dad. That's because she has better opinions, I deadpanned. We both laughed. Then she got serious. I want you to be happy, Mom. I just don't want you to settle again. That word, again, cut a little deeper than she probably meant it to. But she wasn't wrong. Because somewhere along the way in my marriage I had settled. Not for Daniel necessarily, but for the shrinking version of us we became. The woman I was now, she wasn't shrinking for anyone. A month later, Emily and Jacob came home for the weekend. We hadn't had all 3 kids under one roof since before the divorce, and I was nervous. I think they were too. We grilled out back, sat on the patio, drank iced tea like it was still the 90s. At one point, Jacob stood up and said, "All right, Mom. Spill. We've heard whisperings about a man." I rolled my eyes. What is this, an interrogation? Maybe, Emily grinned. Depends on your answers. So I told them about Thomas, about the sprinkler incident, about the way he brings me coffee sometimes just because he was thinking of me, about how he hasn't once tried to fix me, just sits with me in the mess or the joy, like either one is a privilege. Emily smiled wide. You deserve that. Jacob nodded. Just promise us one thing. What's that? Promise you won't try to go backward again. You spent enough years trying to hold together something that wasn't holding you back. I swallowed hard. I promise. And I meant it. Thomas and I weren't perfect. He left his socks everywhere. He whistled through his teeth when he was thinking, which drove me a little crazy. And once he tried to fix the kitchen sink and somehow flooded the whole cabinet. But one night after dinner, I caught him doing the dishes with Lily. Just the 2 of them laughing about some ridiculous TikTok video. And I realized something. This wasn't about replacing Daniel. It was about building something new. Not patching over the ruins, but starting a new garden altogether. Daniel emailed me not long after that. The subject line just said, "I'm sorry." I sat with it for days before I opened it. He wrote that he understood now. That it had taken losing me completely to see how much he'd taken me for granted. That he hoped in time the kids would forgive him. That he was in therapy. That he'd been sober for 2 months. From the delusion, he wrote, that I could find something better by abandoning something good. It wasn't a plea. It was a confession. He ended it with, "I hope you're happy. I really do." And for the first time since the day he left, I believed him. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Because this time I didn't feel like I owed him closure. He'd already given it to me. One evening, Thomas and I were walking through the neighborhood, hand in hand. The air smelled like jasmine and summer coming. He said, "Do you ever miss him?" I thought for a moment. Not him exactly. I missed the version of me that believed forever was guaranteed. But I'm also learning that maybe the best kind of love isn't the one that lasts forever. Maybe it's the one that shows up honest and whole and says, "I choose you. Today." He squeezed my hand. "Well then," he said with a smile, "today I choose you." And just like that, the ache of what I lost softened into something else. Not regret, but reverence. Because what we keep, what really matters, it's never about holding on to the past. It's about carrying forward the parts of ourselves we fought to rediscover. They say grief changes with the seasons. For me, it showed up in early summer, soft around the edges but stubborn as ever. I was living again, laughing, even, but healing is never a straight road. One afternoon at the co-op, while picking up tomatoes for BLTs, Thomas swore by heirloom. A woman tapped my shoulder. "You're Rachel Foster, right?" she asked. I nodded, and she smiled kindly. "I worked with Daniel. And Celeste. I just wanted to say, you handled it all with such grace." I stood there stunned. She added, "You seem happy now." And I realized I was. That night, I told Thomas about it over sandwiches on the porch. He laughed when I called myself a character in someone else's drama. I just want to be the guy who brings the tomatoes. he said. That was the difference. Daniel had once made me feel like a supporting role in my own story. Thomas just sat beside me and let me be. Not long after, Jacob called, his voice trembling. She's here, he whispered. Her name's June. My first grandchild. When I held her, tiny pink, blinking up at me, it felt like the years had folded into something sacred. She gripped my finger, and I whispered, You're going to break hearts, baby girl. But not mine. Thomas waited outside the room at the hospital, letting the moment be ours. But when Jacob saw him, he said simply, Thanks for being here. That's when I knew he belonged in this chapter too. Thanksgiving came fast after that. Lily brought a strange vegan stuffing. Emily overloaded her sweet potatoes with marshmallows. Thomas smoked the turkey and showed up in flannel with Willie Nelson playing on a speaker. We were whole. Maybe not in the way we used to be, but whole all the same. Daniel wasn't there, but he didn't have to be. For the first time, his absence wasn't a wound. It was space we'd filled with something new. Emily had mentioned the old house a few weeks earlier, the one where Daniel and I raised our babies. On a whim, I drove out there. The porch swing was gone. The shutters were blue now, but the trees still leaned sideways, and the steps creaked the same. I didn't knock. I just sat across the street and remembered. The woman who lived there? She was brave if a little lost. I didn't cry for her, but I did thank her. She got me here. Back home. I opened the last box from the attic. Inside was our whole early life. Notes, photos, napkins with business ideas, scribbled love letters. I kept only one photo. The 5 of us on a road trip, unposed, sunburned, messy reel. I framed it, not because I missed Daniel, but because that version of us mattered. Even broken things deserve a shelf. There's this idea we're sold, somewhere along the way, that life has to look a certain way to be called successful. The right house, the right partner, the love story that doesn't crack or fade or leave. But the truth I've come to know, after 25 years of marriage, one betrayal, one hell of a rebuild, and more cups of coffee than I can count, is this. Sometimes the life you end up with isn't the one you planned. It's the one you earned. June was 3 when she pointed at a photo of Jacob as a boy and asked, Why do you look different? I smiled and said, Because I was a different version of myself back then. Did you change? She asked. I did. Because sometimes you have to go through hard things to become someone stronger. Someone softer. Someone freer. She nodded thoughtfully, then added, I like your hair better now. A year later, I wrote her a letter. One she won't read for a long time. But I needed to write it while my heart was still tender from everything it had learned. My darling June, heartbreak isn't the end. It's just the beginning of a new kind of brave. You come from a line of women who bent, but never broke. You're not made of glass. You are made of sky. Build a messy, beautiful life. Dance barefoot. Say yes when it scares you just enough. I love you forever. Grandma Rachel. I still see Daniel sometimes. At birthdays. At recitals. There's a softness to him now. Maybe peace. Maybe regret. We don't talk about the past. But sometimes I catch him looking at me. Not with longing, but with respect. And that's enough. Thomas and I never married. We talked about it. We even tried on rings in a little Vermont shop. But we decided we didn't need the ceremony. We had dinners filled with laughter. Arguments followed by gentle apologies. We had love, the kind you build, not the kind that just happens. And it was more than enough. Now I spend mornings in the garden. I talk to plants like old friends. I wear too much linen and let June braid my hair. Emily runs the business with me. Lily brings over rescue dogs and women with eyebrow piercings. Jacob, he's a wonderful dad. Life isn't perfect, but it's full. It hums. Some nights, I stand on the porch with tea in hand, quilt around my shoulders, looking up at the stars. And I whisper, I didn't just survive it. I built something beautiful from it. This is mine. This is a good full thing. The end.